peace treaty was a trap, but humanity arrived armed and dangerous. The holoscreen inside the assembly hall changed from standard imperial blue to a solid, blinking red. Prime Arbiter Vexarin slammed his hand onto the marble table, his eyes locking onto the tactical map. The network registered 312 capital ships losing structural integrity at the same instant. Sparks showered from the stone arches as the station world jolted from a deep impact. Monitors reported hull failure, their sirens blending into a single wall of noise under the vaulted ceiling. "This is a violation of a neutral summit," Vexarin shouted, his voice cracking as he looked down at the human officer across the table. "Your fleet is attacking a peaceful assembly." He gestured to his security droids, but their systems were spinning in loops, unable to lock onto incoming fire. Fleet Commander Arthur Sterling did not stand up from his seat. He adjusted the creased wool cuff of his dress uniform and reached for the old steel container resting on the polished marble. Vexarin stared at the quiet officer, his eyes frozen on the small container as the emergency alarms began to scream through the pale stone pillars. The entire system was failing, and the guards stood frozen, their weapons useless against an enemy they could not see. "The part that still keeps the surviving High Lords up at night, that comes later. Stay close." Hours before the screen went red, the air inside the spire smelled only of dry ozone and cold stone. Sterling sat perfectly still at the far end of the long hall, listening to the rhythmic clicking of the Imperial Guard platforms. The Corvathi hegemony had ruled this sector for 9,000 years, and they did not expect small delegations to argue with their laws. They viewed the human presence as a simple administrative detail to be filed away before the next local cycle began. Sterling unscrewed the worn cap of his thermal vessel with a slow, mechanical squeak that cut straight through the formal quiet. He did not look at the heavy droids moving into flanking positions behind his chair. He poured a dark, bitter stream of chicory extract into the small lid and waited for the High Arbiter to speak. His face showed no sign of the pressure that normally broke smaller species when they entered the High Assembly. Prime Arbiter Vexarin stepped onto the high platform, his platinum armor throwing cold white light across the empty tiers of seats. He had supervised the forced compliance of 14 separate species during his long career, and he treated this meeting like a final line in a ledger. He looked down his long snout at the human representatives, his posture rigid with the absolute certainty of an empire that had never lost a system. "The terms of the contract are finished," Vexarin announced, his pupils narrowing as his voice echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. "The United Earth Navy will dismantle all Outer Rim defense assets within a short timeline and pull all remaining ships back to your home system. This is the only path permitted if your people wish to be included in the Imperial trade agreements." Sterling took a slow sip of the hot chicory fluid and set the small cup back down on the table with a tiny click. He turned a page in his leather-bound logbook, his fingers completely steady against the paper. He picked up his stylus and made a small mark next to the line indicating the boundary coordinates, ignoring the armored guards who had advanced to the edge of his table. "We read the contract, Arbiter," Sterling said, his voice entirely flat and clear, "but we noted the spatial parameters listed specifically on page 412 of your document." He set the stylus down and looked directly into Vexarin's main eyes, his expression unchanging as the automated recording arrays hovered overhead to catch his response. Vexarin let out a low, clicking sound of amusement from his mandibles, a traditional sign of absolute dismissal among his people. He gestured to his tactical adjutant, who immediately keyed a command into the master terminal to lock the structural borders of the summit zone. The overhead lights shifted from white to purple as the system prepared to log the final refusal. "You have no room for a choice, Commander," Vexarin said, leaning forward over the stone railing. "Even as we speak, 400 Imperial dreadnoughts have exited hyperspace to form a total containment block around this world." He tapped his claw against the stone rail, his face tight with satisfaction as the terminal confirmed the placement of his fleet. With a heavy mechanical thud, the primary blast doors slid shut across the entry arches, sealing the human delegation inside the deep stone rotunda. The security systems locked down every exit vector, cutting off all local communication frequencies as several heavy guard platforms weaponized their plasma arrays. The air grew heavy as the ventilation systems dropped to baseline capacity. "If you do not sign the document before the countdown ends, your worlds will be reclassified as a recovery zone," Vexarin stated, his voice returning to a cold, bureaucratic monotony. "You have a very short window to comply." He turned his back to the table, indicating that the time for discussion had officially ended. At the edge of the high tier, Grand Scholar Leasai adjusted her breathing apparatus as she tracked the human delegation's vital signs on her terminal. She felt a cold, familiar dread as she watched the data lines. The human biosensors showed a complete lack of response to the lockdown sequence, their tracking rows staying flat and motionless. They were not screaming, they were not reaching for sidearms. Liasai leaned toward the Arbiter's main assistant and whispered a warning. Look at the commander's blood pressure. His heart rate has not altered by a single beat since the doors locked. The human is not looking for a way out. She pointed to the system log, where the baseline readings remained perfectly horizontal. The assistant dismissed the ancient scribe with a sharp wave of his armored arm. They are primitives from a low-tier world, scholar. Their entire navy has fewer ships than a single defense squad. They cannot understand the size of the hammer falling on them. He turned back to watch the main clock count down the remaining marks. But far beneath the station's radar shadow, deep inside the cold mass of the primary moon, the heavy cruiser Meridian was already receiving the automated docking signals. Commander Alina Rostova watched her tactical array split into dozens of distinct subsectors as the Imperial fleet took up its positions. Every red marker aligned perfectly with the coordinate grid they had analyzed for decades. The Arbiter has dropped the block, Specialist Chen reported, his hands moving across a black console with mechanical precision. Their dreadnoughts have deployed in a standard containment formation. They have left their ventral profiles completely unshielded according to their manual. He keyed the primary link, sending the targeting vectors to the launch bays. Rostova did not hesitate. She reached for the primary command console and confirmed the system sync. Activate the Prometheus charter protocols. Drop the multispectral screens and let them see what we brought to the table. She turned the master key, sending the authorization sequence across the entire hidden line. In the void outside, the empty space suddenly dissolved. A massive force of heavy kinetic assault platforms emerged from their cloaking shields, their rail-guided launch tubes pre-staged directly inside the Imperial fleet's deployment zone. Several super-dreadnoughts moved into matching cutoff positions, completing a tight kill box around the blockade. Vexarin's personal command slate began to flash with yellow emergency lights as the new signatures registered on the station's sensors. The automated alarms hummed through the floorboards, but the Imperial fleet was too large and clumsy to pivot their heavy plasma batteries before the human targeting arrays locked. The system went quiet as it ran out of functional signatures to log. The registry you analyzed was decades out of date, Prime Arbiter, Sterling said softly, his voice cutting through the rising panic of the Council aides. We didn't come here to negotiate your terms. We came to verify where you parked. He stood up slowly, leaning his hands flat against the smooth stone table. The massive holoscreen behind the platform flickered violently as the first kinetic slugs hit their marks. Vexarin's eyes widened as he watched the blue fleet indicators turn into blinking red markers across the tactical display. The human platforms were firing hypervelocity slugs directly through the unshielded sections of his ships from a vast distance. This is an administrative error, Vexarin stammered, his arms shaking against his platinum chest plate as a second shockwave rocked the stone floor. Your fleet has violated the security bounds of a neutral summit. He reached for his primary relay, trying to send an emergency retreat command, but the interface remained entirely dead. Sterling set his plastic cup down on the marble with a sharp, clear click. He looked up at the high center platform, his face completely calm. No warning signals had saved the Vanguard. No plasma countercharges fired from the Imperial decks. No Imperial survival remained inside the sector. We didn't violate anything, Arbiter, Sterling said. We simply followed the spatial adjustments your own office requested during the early border talks. He picked up his canvas bag and slid his logbook inside. You told us to clear the lanes, Sterling continued, his voice matching the mechanical quiet of the dying consoles. We just made sure we filled the spaces right next to them. He turned away from the table, walking past the deactivated security droids. The primary power grid of the convergence spire failed completely, plunging the Grand Rotunda into total darkness. Only the amber hazard lamps flickered from the lower walls, casting long geometric shadows across the ruins of the marble table. Prime Arbiter Vexarin sank back into his high seat, his heavy armor looking useless as the final report confirmed the loss of 312 warships in less than an hour. Scholar Liasai sat silently in the dim orange glow, watching the human commander walk toward the unlatched blast doors without saying another word to the surviving members of the council. The Imperial dream of absolute compliance lay broken on the floor plates, shattered by the very ledgers they had used to cage the stars. This is a story about the difference between an empire that treats war as a ledger to be signed and a species that treats a peace treaty as a warning to be weaponized. Sterling walked through the cold corridor toward his transport vessel, his boots clicking evenly against the unlit floor panels. He held the scratched steel container tightly against his side. Outside the thick viewing ports, the remnants of the blockade burned like small, silent stars against the dark methane ice oceans below.